Thane Gustafson. To my right on the screen and to my left on the screen are Professor Aurélie of Harvard and Simon Blakey, who is speaking to us from Bradford, England, and who is associated with IHS, a leading consulting company, particularly in the area of energy. Aurélie, I think I may have grabbed the microphone that by rights belongs to you. So over to you, sir.
Not at all. I was just going to introduce you two, and I will, since you've introduced yourselves and me, thank you for that. I'll also say to everyone who's listening, this is a real treat for us today. We probably have the two people in the world who know most about the global energy industry in general, for sure, the most about the European energy industry. And so it's a real pleasure for me to meet Simon and to have Thane, who's also an intellectual hero of mine and whose work I've followed over many years, to participate in this call. So I want to just mention a couple of things. Thane and Simon are going to speak for about 20 minutes in a little show that they've choreographed, not 10 minutes and then 10 minutes, but they'll go back and forth to share some broad thoughts based in part, I think, on Thane's work. I have a copy of the book here. It is a serious book about the European energy industry and about Russian-European energy relations, but for this genre is very lively, highly readable, and definitely worth your time to make sense of the history of how we got to this moment and some thinking through scenarios of where we might be headed. I'd like to invite you, please, to chat in questions as we go, and indeed in the question and answer session as well. And we will collect those questions and I will convey them to Thane and to Simon to, I hope, deliver a kind of conversational tone to this event. This should be a sort of conversation with two extraordinary experts who've decided to share some of their time with us. And with that, I'll hand it over to Thane and to Simon. So thank you again for doing this.
Well, thank you, Aurélie, and thank you very much for your hospitality and that of the Davis Center, which is in a sense my home center, since in the 70s and 80s, those were my Harvard years, both studying and teaching. So virtually speaking, it's very nice to be back. So thank you very much. The book is indeed The Bridge. And so I will follow the good example of a good friend of Simon and mine, Daniel Jurgen, who always says his motto is wave the book, wave the book. So I'm waving the book. It is indeed a serious book, but not too serious. And so as you delve in, you will find some good jokes and some good stories and some good human interest stories, and I will tell you one along the way. So that's The Bridge. And before I begin, though, I want to pay tribute to my friend and colleague, Simon Blakey, who really is the de facto co-author of this book. I scribble the occasional book, but he is the man who knows energy and knows gas. And this book absolutely could not have been written without him. So Simon, it's absolutely delightful that you are here as the co-author of The Bridge. And so we're going to try to make this, we're going to pass the microphone back and forth and make this what we hope will be lively and entertaining. The book in broad outline, first of all, is two histories in one. It is the story of the rise of gas, first of all in the Soviet Union, and then also in Norway. There's a chapter on Norway. There's a chapter on Holland, which Simon will talk about in a moment. And so it's the rise of gas in both places, a new industry, a very exciting industry. Gas was the virtuous fuel in those days, right down to very nearly the present. And so the first of the human interest stories that I want to tell you is going to ring a bell with those of you who last year saw the Sky HBO series on Chernobyl. And you will recall the very remarkable figure, the co-hero of the story, the Deputy Prime Minister for Energy at the time, Boris Sherbina, who was sent to Chernobyl by Gorbachev to find out what the hell was going on in Chernobyl. All was confusion, particularly in Moscow. Now, Sherbina has a long history, a long personal history, which is vital to the story of the bridge. He was a high-ranking party official who was sent to a two-fisted character who was sent to East Siberia to develop the hydropower industry. And he did such a good job of it that he was then promoted to West Siberia to do exactly the same thing. And the Russians had planned a huge series of reservoirs, hydropower plants in West Siberia, and Sherbina was the man to do the job. When he got there, the local geologist said to him, Comrade Sherbina, this is absolutely crazy. You are about to build a worthless hydropower system on top of the world's largest oil and gas reserves. You must not do this. Sherbina went native. He got religion. He went to Moscow. He tried to persuade the bureaucracy. No luck, until finally he got to the prime minister of the day, Alexei Kosygin, and persuaded him. And the rest is history. And that is how the gas industry arose in the Soviet Union. Now, Sherbina, unfortunately for him, got too close to the Chernobyl reactor, and he died 4 years later, clearly of overexposure to radiation. But that's just one of the frequently very moving stories that you will find in this book, which is in a way a romance to a tribute to the virtuous fuel. Simon, over to you. Tell us a little bit about how this industry arose in Europe.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I don't have quite the same depth of individual human interest stories that you do, Thane, on the European side. But what I can say is that, yes, for the individuals who were involved in building the gas industry in Europe in the 1960s and 1970s, there was a great deal of romance and a great deal of emotional engagement in the work that they were doing. It's a very interesting thing to have followed at close quarters over the decades. And going right back to those early days, which the bridge does, it shows that the origins in the Netherlands and the ideas and principles, the business ideas, the commercial principles, and the political engagement that took place in those early days in the Netherlands set themes that have carried on all the way through the subsequent half century. And I'll give you some clues as to what those principles are and those themes are. On the one hand, there's the way in which trade in gas is done, or was done in the early days, as developed by the Europeans, by the Dutch, and exported to the rest of Europe, and then exported into the European relation with the Russians. And there were a set of very specific terms and conditions that grew up. This was the era of the 1960s, 1970s, when state technocracy and central planning was really in its heyday, not just in the Soviet Union, but also in Europe. And what we had was a series of monopoly companies with close relations with their governments, who developed a set of tools that would enable trade to happen across international borders over a very, very long term. And there are a whole set of terms and conditions that were captured in the so-called long-term gas contracts. I think there's a phrase in the book, Thane, where you say that, I think you might be quoting me, saying that hard-bitten commercial men can grow misty-eyed when they talk about the magic of the long-term contracts, which made unmanageable risks manageable and built relationships where there was no relationship before. And it's true. There is a whole emotional side to it, which was very deeply ingrained in the culture of the European gas business, and which carried over in the 60s and 70s into the relationships with the Soviets. As it happened, it coincided from the German point of view, the rise of Ostpolitik and Willy Brandt's desire to find a way of dialogue with the Soviet Union coming out of the really tense time of the Cold War. And the commercial and personal relationships that had developed between the Soviet gas men, the Sherbinas of the world who you mentioned, and his colleagues, and counterparts on the European side, based on the principles developed by the Dutch, was a foundation that created essentially an emotional and political bridge, as well as a commercial bridge in the gas trade. And that's a very important part of the background to what has happened subsequently and to where we are today. And one of the marvelous things about your book, and it's your book, not my book, Thane, is that it tells this story and gives this background, which is absolutely vital if you want to have an understanding, foundational understanding of why we are where we are today.
Well, those are crucial points, Simon, and they're very fundamental. That's half the story of the book. To this day, by the way, the people who became the biggest converts to the Dutch model, the Dutch way of doing business, were the Russians. So that by the time the Soviet Union collapses and the Russians come out into Western Europe, they have been trained in the Dutch model, which to this day they continue to call the Groningen model for setting up contracts, and which they believe is in fact the way the business should be conducted. Simon,
just to interrupt you there, the Groningen model named after the Groningen gas field, which is the foundation of the Dutch gas industry.
Right, thank you very much. Absolutely right. So from the beginning, and Simon's quite right to take us directly to the Willy Brandt story, gas has been in equal parts commercial and geopolitical. And that's particularly relevant when we turn to the present day controversies that surround Russian gas transit. We are all familiar with the narrative that is coming out of Washington. That's a geopolitical narrative, and it says that the Soviets and the Russians have always used gas as a means of leverage over the buyers. That is certainly part of the story. And the whole Willy Brandt story is in equal parts political and commercial. So there's a Washington story coming out and being directed toward Europe, a warning over things like the Nord Stream 2. But what we bring out in this book is an equally powerful, if not more powerful, story coming out of the United States, which is the Chicago story. That's the story of the neoliberal revolution in economics and regulation that overturns the gas industry in the United States in the 60s and 70s on the basis of hubs, of market trading, of auctions, short-term spot trading, and the like. The entire US gas industry is based on those principles now. Did we ever go through a Groningen phase, Simon? But in any case, we moved on. And this revolution then crossed the Atlantic. It overturned the British gas and power industry. Margaret Thatcher was the best known convert. It then hopped over the channel to Brussels. It became the basis for neoliberalism as the basis for regulation in Brussels, with a series of what are famous in the industry as the gas and power directives that turned the entire European gas and power industry upside down, with very far-reaching consequences for the structure of the whole industry. Just to mention one detail, the one company that was the symbol of gas in Germany, Ruhrgas, Gazprom's initial partner in Germany, no longer exists. And that really gives you the measure of the revolution that has taken place in the German gas industry. So Simon, over to you. Take us to Germany.
Well, I will, but I'll take you to the broader Europe as well. Because yes, the world that I described that grew up in the 60s and 70s, that you describe in the book has now gone completely. And it's very important to look at today's gas world with a completely different set of spectacles than the world than the ones that we're used.
Oh, it looks as though we may have lost Simon briefly. Before he comes on, let me just pick up the mic for a moment and say that when these ideas arrived in Germany, it was open warfare. And in particular, the Russians themselves had become converts to the Dutch way, the traditional way of doing business. And when they encountered the ideas that were being pushed forward by Brussels in the neoliberal revolution, they resisted them. They were outraged. One senior Gazprom official went so far as to splutter and to say that these ideas were communism, if you can imagine such a thing. And the result then was conflict between the Russians and their partners. They did find some important partners in Germany, and that's part of what Simon will tell us about. But at the same time, there was conflict between Moscow and Brussels. And at the center of that conflict was the Directorate General for Competition, which was the guardian of competition law in the Commission in Brussels. There was a series of very strong commissioners of what has come to be known as DG Comp in the business, the Directorate General for Competition. And this led finally to open warfare in 2012 and 2013. Now, you may not know this, but it's best not to get on the bad side of DG Comp because they have police powers. DG Comp can launch what they call dawn raids. They can come and knock on your front door. They can barge down the door. They can grab your computers and all your computer records, and they can make off with all of your records and go off and study them and make those the basis for a complaint against you. Those are the formidable powers of DG Comp. Simon, I've stolen a bit of your thunder. Welcome back.
Well, I'm glad you did. There was some technical issue and I was just kicked out.
Welcome back.
I'm back. I take it you've told the story of
a little bit of the story of how the Russians absolutely hated the whole vocabulary that was being spread by Brussels and how this led to the open battle between DG Comp with its police powers and Gazprom, who called them communists.
Yes, that's right, for nationalizing private property, for taking over private property. And of course, I don't know whether you went through the difficulties that Gazprom had were in many ways difficulties that other European companies like Ruhrgas, the one you mentioned, and Eni and Gaz de France had. And they resisted bitterly because of their emotional engagement to the things I referred to earlier. They resisted bitterly the changes that came. But eventually they've all adapted. And the interesting thing too, I think, is that in very recent years, Gazprom and the Russian side too has adapted to the new market rules. It's been very striking that the settlement of the final settlement between DG Comp and Gazprom effectively was Gazprom accepting that it will do its gas trade on European market terms, using spot prices, not the traditional conditions of the long-term prices, and accepting even in the former Soviet satellite space, even in Eastern Europe, now countries that are firmly part of the European Union, that the terms and conditions on which the trade, the bridge operates, the gas bridge operates, will be the ones that are set by European Union rules. I mean, if you think how remarkable the transformation is, this applies not only to Eastern European countries that were in the Soviet orbit, but even to, in the case of the Baltics, countries that were part of the Soviet Union itself. And they are now operating fully under European rules, and Gazprom has adapted to that and accepted it. I don't know if that leads you on to the things that Gazprom has had to accept in Russia itself, as there have been further transformations for the gas industry there, Thane. Maybe I should pass it back to you to talk about the rise of Novatek and LNG and Russia's future.
Well, that's right. I'm conscious of the fact that we have already exceeded Rawi's 20-minute running room, but I feel I have to introduce two final themes from the book. One of them is indeed the fact that we're not just talking about a regulatory revolution here, but also a technological revolution. And the advent of shale gases and LNG has been absolutely central. It'll take another half an hour to go into that, so I won't. But in Q&A, I'm sure the subject will come up. But lastly, the story of the two waves finally comes together in Ukraine. And Ukraine, there's a whole chapter in the book on Ukraine. And so I won't go there in any detail, except to say that Ukraine, not to put too fine a point on it, was plundered by the centrally planned system of the Soviet Union. Its gas resources were emptied out to support the rest of the system. And so when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Ukrainians ended up largely without developed gas left. But what they did have was transit. And so you have here the makings of a very bad marriage, a very conflictual relationship, which is in effect a legacy of the Soviet period. You can't understand what's going on without going back to the Soviet period. It's Ukrainian transit versus Russian gas supplies, and they've been fighting over those two ever since, fighting for leverage ever since. That battle is now coming to an end, and that is, I think, one of the big headlines of the book. Ukraine is gradually developing the basis for independence, gas independence from Russia, and Russia is developing the basis for transit independence from Ukraine. And so our prediction is that within another 10 years, that legacy will be very largely dissipated or commercialized, but in any case, the bad marriage will be ending, and that will be a great benefit for the for political relations across the board, and we believe for tranquility, greater tranquility in Europe, not just in gas, but across the board. So we conclude then with a chapter, and finally I'm going to hand the microphone back to Simon one last time to say a couple of words about the very last chapter, which is about the future of gas. Now all of a sudden gas is no longer universally viewed as the virtuous fuel, but where do we go from here?
Well, where we go from here, Thane, of course, the environmental agenda is by far the most important part of the European story at the moment. And there are two big questions out there. One is the last bits of coal are phased out, notably in Germany. Will that mean more gas demand and more need for Russian gas in the next 5 or 10 years? Answer, probably yes. But thereafter, as we get to the point where we get to really deep decarbonization and getting rid of all hydrocarbons, gas will phase out. So the idea of making contracts now for 20, 30 years into the future, which is where we started back in 1960s and 1970s, is really no longer feasible. And thank goodness we've got a system that is much more responsive to short-term developments in the trading of gas, because the direction of European energy use and European energy policy over the next 20 or 30 years is going to be eventually that gas too will be an industry that will be on its way out. It has, however, a long way to go in the next those 10, 20 or 30 years. And one of the things I noted when I just glanced back at the book today is there is a phrase in there that's saying, for this period, you say the gas bridge is still standing.
The gas bridge is still standing for the very different story ahead. You're going to have to read our next book, but in the meantime, I'll wave the book again. Talk to your friendly booksellers at, well, I don't want to promote a name, but you know where. And our children thank you. So best wishes, and now the microphone finally goes back to Rawi.
So thank you very much, gentlemen, for getting us started on an interesting conversation about both the past and present and future of natural gas in Europe and in Russia and possibly worldwide. I have a few thoughts that I was hoping you might reflect on and offer a few reactions. I want to go back to the misty-eyed comment, the description of these long-term gas contracts.
I've lost
and
you.
I will admit my own nerdy interest in these details, maybe more than some of our viewers, but there's something quite beautiful about the solutions that were created in the first place to make these long-term relationships possible. And I want to just ask you to reflect on two elements of the beauty. So one was commercial. And so this is a little bit in the details, but the glorious beauty of oil indexation. Like, what a genius idea. Like, how do you price a molecule that goes from point A to point B? What's the market value of that molecule with one buyer and one seller at the extreme in terms of what supply and demand is? Simon will rejoin us, I'm sure. But if you think about the elegance of that solution, right? So that means the buyer doesn't control the price. The buyer has no influence on the price. The seller has no influence on the price because it's indexed to the price of something else, a related commodity, but not with the same dynamics. And so basically, God and Saudi gave us the oil price, and then that gave us the gas price. And so there could be no sort of mutual abuse depending on bargaining power at one moment or another. Other elements like take or pay that created incentives for building the infrastructure that was necessary, all of these wrapped into contracts that were written for a long time. So there's a very elegant beauty in the commercial solutions of those contracts. And the other beauty, and this is more future looking, was the fact that we ended up with very close firm to firm relationships, or for a while, firm to ministry relationships, which no matter how bad things got geopolitically during the Cold War or after, seemed to me to be kind of a stabilizing force in the politics of Europe and Eurasia, that you had these firms which knew each other very well, individual executives who knew each other very well. And so as we make our way away from that moment, away from those principles, away from the real possibility of long-term contracts, what will we lose in the commerce in terms of how the solutions create different kinds of incentives for suppliers and for buyers? And what will we lose geopolitically when we don't really have those kinds of executive to executive and firm to firm, deep entrenched relationships that were a kind of stabilizing force?
Well, Simon's just come back on in the nick of time. For the sake of continuity, I'm just going to pick up on your second question and leave the first question to Simon, who can really give you a much more competent answer. Simon, Rawi's second question had to do with the continuity of personal relationships that arose in the heroic days of the gas industry. Can you, you don't seem to be moving. Are you actually back on? Looks as though he's not quite yet. So I will take the second question and then hope that he will come back on right away. You're absolutely right, Rawi, that what characterized the gas industry, and particularly the negotiations, the early dealings between the Soviets and the West Europeans, the Austrians in particular, because they are the ones who led off the business. These relationships formed over a period of decades. And they were still there. They were not interrupted by the end of the Soviet Union, actually. They didn't come to an end really until a decade later or so, when the present management of Gazprom came in with Alexei Miller, and the last survivors left the scene. One of those extraordinary stories was a man named Stepan Derezhov, who, as a young engineer, was sent by the then founder of the gas industry to Italy to explore with the Italians the idea of a gas pipeline all the way from Siberia to Italy. And the Italians initially were disbelieving. Such a thing is not possible. And there was no precedent for it. Well, Derezhov, after several days of discussions, went back to Moscow. He had been sent to Italy as a secret mission, without the knowledge of the Politburo, without the knowledge of any of the top leadership, by the head of the gas industry, to explore this revolutionary concept. And he came back. He came up with a business plan in his apartment, took it to the head of the gas industry, and this became a memo for, once again, Kosygin, to push the idea of direct gas exports so as to finance the pipelines, so as to get the compressors. Well, the point of my story is that Derezhov, half a century later, is the head of international relations for Gazprom. By this time, is an old man. Classic example of those who stepped over the bodies of their colleagues back around World War II, after the great Stalin purges, that sort of thing. These people were still in command well into the second decade of the post-Soviet period. So your point, exactly, Rawi. And now we have Simon back to us to answer what was your real question.
Well, I hope I can stay on. I don't know what's happening. I'm sorry about the technical problems. Ravi, I missed the first part of the question. You're going to have to repeat it. You said, all I heard was, I'd like to take us back to mid, and it could have been mid anywhere.
Yeah. So the comments about the misty-eyed feelings about long-term contracts and the ways in which those long-term contracts built relationships over time that were useful geopolitically, and Thane was offering a few reflections on that, but also the kind of elegant beauty of the commercial solutions that went into the long-term contracts. And so I was admitting my nerdy interest in some of those elements and how useful it was to have oil indexation, how useful it was to have take or pay elements of those contracts in order to really align incentives and avoid unnecessary conflict between the contracting parties. So what does it mean for the geopolitics of Europe and Eurasia that we won't have those kinds of stabilizing firm-to-firm relationships? And what will it mean for the commercial elements of the industry that we also don't have those incentive-aligned, incentive-compatible contractual arrangements which made long-term contracts possible in the first place? Like, what kind of business will we have without those elegant, beautiful, long-term contractual arrangements?
Well, you're right. And of course, what we had was a set of relationships, a business that was based on relationships. You were dealing at a time, it was the Cold War. I mean, you know, we were pointing intermediate range nuclear missiles at each other, communicating. There were not that many channels of communication. And the human, the people, the professionals who developed these contracts were making enormous commitments for their companies. I mean, billions of dollars that lasted not just years, but decades into the future. You know, the tension and the trust that was developed around those things was enormous. So the individuals became very prominent in their companies on the European side, and the relations that they had with their Soviet counterparts were leverageable essentially in terms of when politicians wanted to talk to each other. And these were, they could deal with people who already had long established knowledge. Now, We don't need that kind of parallel track these days simply because communications are very much better. There are all sorts of vehicles for communication across difficult areas. It is very interesting where there are tense relations still and relations still being built, that these long-term contracts in energy and indeed in gas are still part of the picture. You find it in Asia. It's very interesting, the Chinese-Russian relationship as it's developed over the last 15 years. Part of the story has been the Gazprom relationships with the Chinese energy sector, and they've been looking at the same sort of long-term contractual terms that were the case in Europe. I don't think they're not needed in the same way though today as they were then, because there are these other alternatives. How the business has changed, that too, it isn't as necessary. Because the kind of risks that were being managed by take-or-pay terms, indexation, above all, the flexibility around the take-or-pay terms. This is what people really forget and don't understand about the contracts. It wasn't the solidity of the commitment. It was the flexibility that was built in, that could be negotiated, that was structurally part of the negotiation during the life of the contract. That's what created the relationship, and that's what created the security, the safety around them, the commercial safety around the risk. When you have very liquid, fully functioning markets like the oil market has been for decades, you can do it through anonymous relationships. You know, anonymous traders can do things, because if you fall out of one deal, you can drop into another one because the liquidity is there. There are plenty of other people. That's the nature of the gas business for the most part globally today, and certainly in Europe. So neither politically nor commercially do we need for the future the same kind of things that were built then. But that's not to underestimate what they achieved. They achieved a great deal.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions coming in from our audience, and thank you for those. One of them has to do with the relationship between Gazprom and Novatek. Before the development of liquefied natural gas capabilities in Russia, Gazprom and Novatek had one particular kind of relationship. And now it seems that Rosneft and Novatek and Gazprom are being obliged to recast their relationships with one another as LNG develops. Could either or both of you offer a few reflections on how those relationships are being recast?
That's for you, Thane.
You're quite right, Rawi, to mention Novatek. Novatek is the most interesting story in the Russian gas landscape in the last generation, if not two. What we have here is a genuine startup which has come out of nowhere. The founder was not even in the gas business. He was the son of a pipeline contractor in the Volga area, as I remember. He started in the far north. It was the pipeline business that took him there originally. He started picking up a few gas properties that were lying around, mainly the creation of local geologists who had no way of monetizing them. He then realized that you could actually start monetizing the gas liquids that come along with natural gas, so-called condensate, and you could then export the condensate and actually make money at a time when the gas itself was virtually worthless. And so one thing led to another, and he bought more gas properties and did the same thing over again. And it wasn't too long before he found himself in a position when the shale gas revolution came along in the United States and the possibility of LNG arose as a technology. He realized the potential of that at a time when Gazprom itself was absolutely not interested. Gazprom is a way of being a very large organization with the inertia that is often characteristic of large organizations. And Gazprom wanted nothing to do with LNG. They did go through an early LNG romance a decade before, in which they imagined that they would be able to export LNG to North America. And of course, we were all ready for that at the time. But then, boom, along comes the shale revolution in the United States, and suddenly we're not buying LNG from Russia anymore, or those plans were canceled. Gazprom found itself without an LNG strategy. In comes the founder of Novatek, Leonid Mikhelson, and he starts developing LNG with everything that goes with. Putin likes this very much. As far as Putin is concerned, LNG, well, gas is the future of energy, and LNG is the future of gas. So Novatek and Mikhelson are Putin's favorites, and away we go.
So another couple of questions have come in. One I think is very presentist, but is built on the history that you're describing. And that is about Nord Stream 2, which is, as probably many of our viewers know, another pipeline project that would connect directly Russia and Germany. And the question is really more about the transatlantic relationship than it is about the European-Russian relationship and about sanctions. And so just to frame the question a bit more, the sanctions regime in the United States is mostly unilateral, in the sense that these days US sanctions are decided only by the United States and not in close cooperation with its transatlantic partners. And extraterritorial, which is to say that they apply beyond the sovereign borders of the United States to any entity that engages with the US market or the US financial system, which is more or less every firm in the world. And so this recent set of sanctions by the United States that seems specifically to target European companies working on the Nord Stream 2 project. What is your sense of the logic of them, and what is your sense of the implications more broadly for the transatlantic relationship as European governments express frustration with the fact of the unilateralism and extraterritoriality of the sanctions?
Well, I go first, Thane.
This is actually a question for Rawi. And this gives us an opportunity to toss a small bouquet in your direction, because as preparation for this meeting, we both read your great essay on sanctions. So I don't think you can escape this one. Would you like to give us some views of your own?
Well, I'll just, yeah, no, go ahead, Simon, please.
Let me just say, of course, this is...
Uh-oh.
Well, I'll share a few thoughts. I think that Nord Stream 2, as Nord Stream 1 was, is a commercial project with geopolitical implications. There are no gas pipeline projects that do not have geopolitical implications. They all essentially have geopolitical implications. On the other hand, nobody builds a pipe to transport anything unless it makes commercial sense, including gas. And so if we see Nord Stream 2 in that way, it's not some nefarious plot to do anything. It's a commercially driven project. But to make reference to your Washington story, that the narrative from Washington is that it is a geopolitically driven project more than it is a commercially driven project, and not just a commercial project that has geopolitical implications. This, I think, fits in a long-standing collection of tensions between the United States and Europe about whether Europe should be in charge of its own gas security, or whether the United States ought to help Europe achieve a kind of gas security that Europe is not seeking. And so my sense is that this set of extraterritorial and unilateral sanctions has quite infuriated many European political leaders and many executives in the European energy industry. Why the United States should have a view that it can actually express through sanctions about what Europe wants to do with which gas molecules and which pipe under which sea, I think is genuinely mystifying. That the United States feels like it ought to have a view and then to try to enforce that view. So that's my reaction to it. The paradox is that the closeness of the Russian-European energy relationship led to US policies that are actually making the transatlantic relationship worse, which is such a strange outcome if you think about what the point of the policy was in the first place. The point of the policy was to drive Europe and Russia further apart, and instead it's driving Europe and the United States further apart. Thane, I don't know if you wanted to share a reaction to that thesis.
Well, first of all, I agree with you entirely, and I know that Simon does too. Just three quick comments to put the question back into the context of the book. A point about the past, a point about the present, and a point about the future. The point about the past is that the Russians have had as a consistent matter of policy now for 20 years to diversify away from Ukraine. Remember the point that the Ukrainians ended up with the transit and the Russians ended up with the gas. That was a very uncomfortable relationship as far as the Russians were concerned, the Ukrainians too, but the Russians, and they started building bypasses, the very first one being years ago, Blue Stream across the Black Sea, and so forth. So Nord Stream 2 is actually the end. It's the capstone of a 20-year policy, which by now is reaching completion. The story is over. So that's point one from the past. The point from the present is that as a result of the regulatory and technological changes that have taken place in the European gas industry, the seller no longer has the leverage. The leverage is entirely on the side of the buyer. Consequently, there is no such thing as Russian geopolitical or commercial leverage over the Europeans. We can go into the details of that, but it's a matter of the interconnectedness, it's a matter of the LNG, it's a matter of the spot market. Every which way, the seller is disadvantaged. And the Russians know that, and they had to accept that. That was the lesson of the DG Comp struggle. And then finally, a point about the future. Think about what is happening in a long-term perspective here. Russia, Gazprom, has just finished investing for the last 15 years in a whole new generation of gas from Yamal, from the far north. And it has just finished investing in a whole new network of delivery pipelines. Now, Gazprom, the irony of the situation is that Gazprom has managed to assure the future of something that may be a declining business in Europe.
Interesting. And on the sanctions point, Simon and Thane mentioned a paper that I wrote. I thought I would just be sure to mention that I wrote that paper with Aurélie Bros, who is another expert on Europe and on European energy and Russian energy, and indeed on global energy issues. And we're not selling that paper. You can download it for free on the French International Relations website, EFRI website, if you're interested in pursuing that. So another question that has come up, and I want to use this question in a new way, since you mentioned the absence of leverage that suppliers have now relative to buyers, that it's really become a buyer's market. All of these new contractual conditions recast the relationship really quite fundamentally between buyers and sellers. And I wanted to ask, is it not the case that Russia is now doubly impaired, as it were, by this recasting of contractual relationships. So one, it was always true that dependence was mutual. The Europeans relied on Russia for gas, and Russia relied on Europe as the only profitable market in the world, including Russia, for the sale of Russian gas. So that continues to be true. So the Europeans in some sense are less dependent in some, both literally and in a kind of more abstract sense. There are multiple suppliers. Now in the context of what is likely to be a sustained slump in energy prices as a result of the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, do we not see the Russian state in an even more vulnerable position? Not only has the Russian supplier, Gazprom in particular, been made more vulnerable by these market conditions, but the Russian state is even more vulnerable to the maintenance of the profitability of Gazprom, which is one of the key inputs into the Russian federal budget in terms of keeping it stable. So would you go so far as to turn that conventional narrative really on its head, that it's not that Europe is dependent on Russia and Russia's holding this gas weapon, but maybe exactly the other way around these days? How should we think about these relations of dependence and who is more dependent upon whom?
Well, since I've missed, maybe I could step in here. And yeah, I mean, you're right to say that the relationship was always one of mutual interdependence. Yeah, you've got the gas, we said to the Russians, but we've got the money. And that was, we always had alternatives in terms of getting energy if we'd, but money is money. So there was always mutual interdependence, and that is the case. I don't know, I mean, you're right, of course, currently there's a sense that we should distinguish between the current buyer's market condition, because there's a lot of gas around and not much demand as a result of COVID-2, and the structural changes in the way in which gas trading is done. So I'm reluctant to say just because of COVID-2, this puts Russia in a big problem in relation to the gas industry. Thane, you'll want to comment on the budget aspects, etc. As Europe has diversified its supplies and its ways of trading gas, so Russia, of course, the obvious logical strategic alternative is that Russia diversifies its markets. And the whole pivot to the east in Russia is entirely logical in that context. And I think that's probably the key to the Russian gas future is in the east. Thane.
Well, Ravi, I don't want to miss this opportunity. Certainly Daniel Jürgen would not miss this opportunity to hold up here another book, which is called Klimat. That's my next book. I'm in the middle of writing it now. And Harvard has very kindly given me another contract to write another book with them. So visualize then a book called Klimat, The Future of Russia in the Era of Climate Change. And it addresses, in fact, that very point that you have raised. So as the saying goes, wave the book. Meanwhile, I'm writing hard on every aspect of this because it's not just oil and gas. But if you ask Putin, he will say, well, there may be problems with oil and gas, which he doesn't admit for a minute. But in addition to that, we will be exporting high tech. And by the way, have you looked at our exports of nuclear power lately? And so this is very much a broader set of topics ranging across the entire Russian economy. And this raises literally the question of what the future of Russia will be by mid-century in the era of climate change. Simon, you've been extremely patient with the technological glitches we've had. And I think it's only fair that we hand the mic back to you for your closing thoughts on this whole epic that is, we've taken our audience through, what, 60 years of history now, which coincides with at least some of our lifetime.
Yes.
So will we look back on it all?
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, it's been my entire professional lifetime. I mean, I was a kid and a teenager when when those things were developing in the 1960s and 70s that I began my remarks, and now I'm approaching retirement. So I've seen the gas industry grow from nothing to a quarter of Europeans' energy supply. It's very important as we look forward. Clearly, the next 50 or 60 years will be driven by the climate agenda, and that's why you're writing the new book. I think one thing that we really need to bear in mind is that that growth to a quarter of Europe's energy supply for gas means that gas is bigger in European energy than electricity. Electricity is just over a fifth, a bit less than a quarter. Renewables, which is where all the focus is at the moment in terms of political attention and the climate agenda, renewables are only a part of Europe's electricity, getting bigger, but still a part. So there are, and then if you look at renewables itself, when you say the word renewables, we all think of wind and solar in the climate context. But half of the renewable electricity in Europe is old-fashioned hydro and biomass, and there have to be questions about its climate neutrality. So we're looking at an energy transformation that Europe has on its agenda. That will take time. And of course, from the climate point of view, that's exactly what we don't have. The role that the gas industry has played for many years has been in substituting quickly for the higher carbon fuels. And in doing that, of course, it's contributed a lot more to reducing CO2 emissions than the renewables have done so far. They have to do, renewables will do more in the future. And this is something that is a message that is slightly lost on a lot of today's policymakers in Europe. That the relationship with Russia and the supply of gas from Russia and elsewhere remains actually very important if you want a quick reduction in CO2 emissions, which is what the climate needs. Long term, structurally, we need to see the transformation. But for the time being, for the environment, the gas bridge with Russia remains important. And that's where really I'd like to finish my thoughts about this and to say how the bridge that you've written about, Thane, links into the climate that you're about to write about.
Thane, do you want to take 30 more seconds worth of reflection on Simon's observation that gas is essential for, I don't want to put words in Simon's mouth, but to broadly that gas is essential for the progress that we need to make quickly, even if the structural transformation later on will push gas out?
I'll mention only the obvious point that we haven't pronounced the word China, I believe. And in China, the Chinese very much see gas in the way that Simon has just described it. That is to say, as a quick answer to what is still a coal-dominated energy sector. But Simon, I don't want to leave out the opportunity for you to say a word about something that I know you're working on very actively now, and that's hydrogen. Would you like to say a word about hydrogen?
Yeah, I mean, if we have to get to very, very deep decarbonization by mid-century, then there has to be something other than electricity that does it. In order to, to have gaseous fuels and liquid fuels, essentially the only way to produce that at the point of use, which is zero carbon, is to use something like hydrogen. And there is a great deal of work going in both business and from the business point of view, the technology point of view, and the political point of view to enable that to happen. And that too will be an interesting story in terms of the relations with Russia, because there are two ways of making clean hydrogen. One is with electricity through electrolysis, and the other is using methane itself and storing the carbon and splitting the methane. And there are various ways of doing that. The Russians are very keen on a new technology called pyrolysis. It's not in the front runners at the moment in terms of what Europeans are looking at, but clearly the discussions and commercial relationships and politics of this over the next few years are going to very much focus on that. Yeah.
All right. Well, very stimulating and interesting discussion. Thank you very much, Thane. Thank you very much, Simon. And thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. Hope to see you in person, all of you, at some point. Meanwhile, stay safe and well, and